My therapist was recording me and selling my trauma to a podcast. A betrayal I never expected. I was scrolling through my phone on a Wednesday evening when I heard my own voice describe my panic attack. Not just any panic attack. The specific one from my therapy session 2 weeks earlier. The one I'd only ever told Dr. Patricia Hale about. I froze. My coffee cup was halfway to my lips, and for a moment, I couldn't remember how to swallow. The voice was coming from a podcast called Unfiltered Minds. I had never heard of it before, but there was my voice, painfully recognizable, distorted slightly but unmistakably mine, describing the exact symptoms I'd confessed to Patricia. The racing heart, the feeling of drowning in air, the certainty that I was dying even though logically I knew I wasn't. This client, let's call her Kate, presented with classic anxiety triggers, a different voice explained. It was Patricia. It was absolutely, unmistakably Patricia, my therapist of 3 years. She experiences hyperventilation and dissociation during episodes. What's particularly interesting is how her panic manifests as a conviction that she's having a medical emergency, despite normal vital signs. I put my phone down and picked it back up 3 times. I listened to the episode again. Then I listened to another episode from the podcast, and another. In the next episode, they discussed a man's depression and suicidal ideation. The details were specific, the voice was different, but the pattern was identical. Someone's private therapy session, exposed and analyzed for public consumption, with barely a whisper of changed details to protect anonymity. That's when I knew. I wasn't hearing things. I wasn't paranoid or misinterpreting. My therapist, the woman I had paid thousands of dollars to create a safe, confidential space where I could process my trauma, was recording my sessions and selling them to a podcast. My entire body went numb. And then rage. Then a sickening feeling of violation that made me want to shower until my skin fell off. I searched the podcast archives frantically. Unfiltered Minds had been running for 8 months. There were 47 episodes. How many of them featured my therapy sessions? How many times had I shared my darkest thoughts, my most vulnerable moments, only to have them packaged and monetized for strangers to consume like entertainment? I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, replaying every session I could remember. Every time I'd cried. Every time I'd admitted something I'd never told another soul. Every time I'd trusted Patricia with pieces of my fractured self. The podcast had advertising, sponsors. It was making money. And Patricia, Dr. Patricia Hale, licensed therapist, holder of my trust, guardian of my confidentiality, was profiting from my pain. I spent the next morning calling the licensing board. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. The woman who answered was sympathetic but unhelpful. She took my complaint and explained that they would need to open an investigation. These things took time, she said. There were procedures. Procedures like my violated privacy was just another bureaucratic box to check. I called a lawyer next. She was less sympathetic and more useful. This is a clear HIPAA violation, she said, her voice clipped and professional. Unauthorized recording of therapy sessions, disclosure of protected health information, and profiting from those disclosures. This is big, and it's illegal. But you're going to need proof. Proof. I already had proof. I had my own ears. I had the podcast. I had the specific details that only I and Patricia would know. But the lawyer explained that I needed documentation. I needed to prove that the voice on the podcast was actually Patricia. I needed to prove that the details matched my therapy sessions. I needed to show a pattern of abuse of the therapeutic relationship. So I started recording. I called Patricia and scheduled an emergency session. I told her I was having a crisis. I didn't tell her that the crisis was discovering that she was a criminal. Before we continue, we would like to thank all of you who support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing our content. The only appreciation we ask of you is that you subscribe, like, and share this video if you are not yet one of our subscribers. Thank you. I went to that session on a Friday afternoon. Her office was exactly as I remembered it. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, boxes of tissues, the whole aesthetic designed to make people feel safe. Safe. The word felt obscene now. Patricia greeted me with her usual warmth. "Kate, you sounded upset on the phone. What's going on?" I sat down in the chair across from her and tried to appear normal, tried to sound like a patient in crisis rather than someone who had discovered a horrific betrayal. "I've been having intrusive thoughts," I said, which was true. I keep imagining scenarios where people I trust hurt me, where they expose my secrets. Patricia nodded, taking notes. She was probably already planning how she'd spin this into her next podcast episode. Tell me more about these scenarios, she said. Well, I continued carefully, I imagine someone who's supposed to protect my privacy violates it. Someone who I pay to listen to me uses what I tell them against me. Someone I confided in becomes my enemy. Her expression didn't change. She just kept writing in her notebook. Those are powerful fears, she said thoughtfully. Where do you think they come from? I almost laughed. I almost told her exactly where they came from. Instead, I said, I'm not sure, but I was wondering, do you ever record our sessions, Patricia? The silence that followed was deafening. She looked up from her notepad, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Fear, recognition, guilt. Of course not, she said, but her voice had changed. It was higher, tighter. You know the confidentiality agreements. Recording therapy sessions without consent would be completely unethical and illegal. She knew. She definitely knew what she was doing was wrong. Right, I said quietly. Completely unethical and illegal. I left that session with everything I needed. I had her voice. I had her on record discussing the legality of recording sessions, and I had the concrete knowledge that she was lying to my face about whether she did it. That weekend I listened to every episode of Unfiltered Minds that I could identify as mine. There were six episodes of my private pain, my confidential disclosures, my therapy work. All of it turned into content for public consumption. I found the podcast's website. There was an About section that listed Patricia as the host and creator. There were social media accounts where she promoted the episodes with quotes from the sessions. She was building a brand on the backs of her traumatized clients. The worst part was realizing that I wasn't her only victim. There were dozens of people featured in those episodes. Dozens of people whose lives were being dissected and analyzed without their knowledge or consent. Some of the cases discussed included details so specific that anyone who knew those people would immediately recognize them. I contacted one of them, a man whose session about his infidelity and guilt had been featured prominently. He wept on the phone when I told him what Patricia was doing. He felt the same violation, the same rage, the same profound sense of betrayal. We contacted others. We formed an informal group of victims. There were ultimately 8 of us who could confirm that our private therapy sessions had been recorded and broadcast without consent. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal case would be straightforward. But nothing could undo the damage. Nothing could give me back the privacy I'd lost. Nothing could take away the knowledge that every vulnerable moment I'd shared with Patricia had been ammunition in her quest to build a podcast empire. I realized something during that dark weekend. I had come to therapy because I needed to heal. I had trusted Patricia with my trauma, my pain, my deepest fears, and she had turned that trust into a weapon and used it against me. The lawsuit took shape over the following weeks. My lawyer, along with 3 others representing the victims, compiled everything we had: the podcast episodes, voice analysis confirming Patricia's voice, therapy notes I'd kept that matched the details discussed on air, screenshots of the podcast's sponsorship deals and revenue sharing. We sent a cease and desist letter. We demanded that all episodes featuring us be removed from distribution. We demanded compensation for the violation of our privacy and the breach of our confidentiality agreements. Patricia's response came through her lawyer. She claimed the podcast was educational. She claimed that the details had been changed sufficiently to protect anonymity. She claimed that by discussing her therapeutic work, she was advancing the field and helping people understand mental health better. Her claims were delusional. The details hadn't been changed at all. My panic attack symptoms, my job as a graphic designer, my ex-boyfriend named Tyler, every identifying detail remained. Anyone who knew me could have listened to that podcast and recognized themselves in my story. The licensing board formally opened an investigation. They contacted Patricia for a statement. I watched from the outside as the machinery of professional accountability slowly cranked to life. But the podcast kept running. Patricia kept releasing new episodes. She apparently didn't think she would face real consequences. Then, about 2 months into our lawsuit, something shifted. A journalist from a major news outlet had picked up the story. They interviewed me and the other victims. They researched Patricia's background. And they discovered something even worse than what we already knew. Patricia had been sued before, 5 years earlier, by another client who claimed she had disclosed confidential information. That lawsuit had been settled quietly, with a non-disclosure agreement. She'd done this before. She'd violated confidentiality before, and apparently, she'd learned no lesson. The news story went viral. Within 48 hours, Unfiltered Minds was being discussed on major news networks. Patient advocacy groups called for Patricia to lose her license. Mental health professionals released statements condemning her actions as a fundamental betrayal of therapeutic ethics. Patricia issued a public apology, but it was too late. The damage was done. Within a week, every streaming platform had removed her podcast. Sponsors dropped her. The digital footprint of her violation began to disappear, though the memory of it would never fully disappear for those of us who had experienced it. Before we continue, we would like to thank all of you who support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing our content. The only appreciation we ask of you is that you subscribe, like, and share this video if you are not yet one of our subscribers. Thank you. The licensing board filed formal charges. The investigation concluded that Patricia had indeed recorded sessions without consent, disclosed protected health information, and violated her therapeutic obligation in ways that endangered her clients. She lost her license. Her career as a therapist was over. Our lawsuit settled 6 months later. We received compensation for the violation of privacy, the breach of contract, and the emotional distress. But I remember thinking, as I signed the settlement paperwork, that no amount of money could truly repair what had been done. I had come to therapy broken and seeking healing. I had left it broken and additionally traumatized. The real reckoning came later, when I had to rebuild my understanding of what therapy was supposed to be. I had to grieve the loss of trust in the profession that was supposed to help me. I had to process the violation of having my private pain turned into entertainment. It took me almost a year before I could trust another therapist. And when I finally did, I had to disclose everything that had happened. I had to bring all my new trauma into a therapeutic relationship that was supposed to be safe. My new therapist, Dr. James, was gentle but direct about what had happened to me. "You experienced a betrayal that mimicked the original trauma you came to therapy to process," he said in one of our early sessions. "Patricia didn't just violate your privacy, she weaponized the very tool that was supposed to help you heal." That realization, that Patricia had essentially traumatized me in the same way my original wounds had traumatized me, was both devastating and clarifying. It meant I needed to process this not just as a legal violation, but as a genuine trauma that required genuine healing. Slowly, with time and work and a therapist I could actually trust, I began to rebuild. I began to understand that what happened to me and the other victims wasn't a reflection of therapy being fundamentally unsafe. It was a reflection of one person choosing to abuse her position of power in an unforgivable way. I also started advocating. I connected with patient advocacy groups. I spoke to legislators about strengthening HIPAA protections and adding more severe penalties for therapists who violate confidentiality. I wanted to make sure that what happened to me and the others wouldn't happen to someone else. Years later, I look back on that Wednesday evening when I heard my own voice coming from a podcast, and I'm amazed at how much has changed. The violation doesn't sting the way it used to. The betrayal has transformed into something else: determination to make the system better, to protect other people, to hold professionals accountable when they abuse their positions of trust. Patricia Hale never practiced therapy again. She moved out of state. The podcast episodes, though removed from mainstream platforms, still circulate on archive sites. But the story of her violation has become a teaching moment, a cautionary tale about the importance of confidentiality and the dangers of unchecked ambition in the mental health field. I learned something fundamental through this experience. Healing is not linear, and trust is the most fragile thing we offer to another person. When that trust is violated, the path back to wholeness requires not just legal victory, but genuine internal transformation. I'm in a much better place now. I still see Dr. James. I still struggle with anxiety, but I'm learning to sit with it rather than fight it. And I'm learning to trust again, not blindly, but wisely. Sometimes I think about the 8 of us who were victimized by Patricia. I think about how we became a community through tragedy. I think about how we used our collective pain to create change. And I realize that maybe, in some strange way, something good came from something terrible. But I would trade it all in a heartbeat to have my privacy back, to have my healing journey unmarred by professional betrayal, to have never experienced the particular devastation of discovering that the person you trusted with your most vulnerable self used that trust against you. That's a lesson I'll carry with me forever. The importance of verifying that the people we trust with our mental health are truly trustworthy. The importance of institutional oversight. The importance of legal protections that mean something. And maybe most importantly, the knowledge that healing from betrayal is possible, but it requires extraordinary strength, patience, and the willingness to keep trusting, even after trust has been broken.